state of Florida does not allow you to record other people without their permission. So every week we're going to ask permission for that, but we've set it up so my face will be showing. Welcome to Bible study. This is November 11th. Today is Veterans Day, and we are in Leviticus chapter 24. I am reading from the New Living Translation. Let me turn off that fan to get a little less background noise. So I'm in chapter 24, but for those of you who maybe haven't caught the other studies while we've been going through Leviticus, Leviticus is an instruction manual for priests and the Levite family. Not every Levite was a priest, but all male Levites worked in or for or with the temple and tabernacle in some capacity. So this is the book about how to lead the sacred Israelite community. So a lot of times you'll hear this is a law perpetual, or this is something you always must do. And it's important to realize this is within the context and framework of temple worship, tabernacle leadership, and this ideology that the secular and sacred leadership of the community are one and the same. There is no difference in this time for the Israelite people. We know later on there will come a difference, but for right now, the leader of the community religiously and politically is the same. So here we are in chapter 24. The Lord said to Moses, "Command the people of Israel to bring you pure oil of pressed olives for the light, to keep the lamps burning continually. This is the lampstand that stands in the tabernacle in front of the inner curtain that shields the Ark of the Covenant. Aaron must keep the lamps burning in the Lord's presence all night. This is a permanent law for you, and it must be observed from generation to generation. Aaron and the priest must tend to the lamps on the pure gold lampstand continually in the Lord's presence." Now, for those of us who are Episcopalian and have a more higher church variety, or those of us who've been Catholic, you'll recognize that there is a light in the sanctuary, the next to the ambry or the tabernacle, where we keep the consecrated host in reserve sacrament. And that light, that lampstand, is the light of the presence. And so that candle is supposed to be lit always as a sign of the presence of God within. Now, we get this from this passage. And also within the Ark of the Covenant was kept a ephah of manna. So they kept some of the manna that they collected in the wilderness as a sign forever of God's presence and provision with them. And so we adopted that practice within our traditions. Now, we don't use a lamp of pure gold, and some churches use a electric light, which we are currently using as well for reasons of fire safety or usage of smoke and all kinds of other things. But the practice of having a light that symbolizes the presence of God within comes from this practice. Verse 5, "You must bake 12 flat loaves of bread from choice flour, using 4 quarts of flour for each loaf. Place the bread before the Lord on the pure gold table and arrange the loaves in 2 stacks, with 6 loaves in each stack. Put some pure frankincense near each stack to serve as a representative offering, a special gift presented to the Lord. Every Sabbath day, this bread must be laid out before the Lord as a gift from the Israelites. It is an ongoing expression of the eternal covenant. The loaves of bread will belong to Aaron and his descendants, who must eat them in a sacred place, for they are most holy. It is the permanent right of the priests to claim this portion of the special gifts presented to the Lord." So again, remember the Levites, they weren't given land within the new territory. they are provided for out of the offerings that people bring. And so here we have oil and bread as sacred symbols within the Israelite community. Now, this is just a reminder. They've already talked about this a bunch of different times, but it's being brought up again. And repetition tells us that this is something important. Either perhaps they hadn't been doing it right, they might have been forgetting to do it, or maybe some people in the community were grumbling about why is there this bread that we have to bring to the priests, or why are we always having to bring them flour? God issues a reminder. This is why. This is what this is for. And so this is part of what it means to be an Israelite and temple worship, is that you're always having lamps burning. You're always going to have a bull offered in the morning and in the evening, and you're always going to have bread on the Sabbath day. So now we're going to go from holy bread to talk about punishment and blaspheming. So verse 10, one day a man who had an Israelite mother and an Egyptian father came out of his tent and got in a fight with one of the Israelite men. During the fight, the son of an Israelite woman blasphemed the name of the Lord with a curse. So the man was brought to Moses for judgment. His mother was Shelomith, the daughter of Dibri of the tribe of Dan. They kept the man in custody until the Lord's will in the matter should become clear to them. So we have someone who has not just taken the Lord's name in vain, but has actually cursed God. And so rather than deciding what needs to be done, they bring the man to Moses and they wait for God to make it clear. This is already a break with the surrounding culture and with the common methods of punishment of the day. The idea that it belongs to the leader and to have wisdom and discernment of God's will before inflicting punishment was something foreign. But this is a really good development in the culture that God is instilling in these people. So verse 13, then the Lord said to Moses, take the blasphemer outside the camp and tell all those who heard the curse to lay their hands on his head. So here we have that you have to have the witnesses, the people who actually heard it, who actually saw it, not just who said something about it. This is something that we as a culture in our country really need to remember. Anecdotes are not evidence, and we must be careful to look for direct, trustworthy testimony from people. And if people are not willing to swear to what they have seen in court, then there's a problem. And this is what God is setting up. So they have to lay their hands on his head. They have to publicly show, we heard this. Then let the entire community stone him to death. Say to the people of Israel, those who curse their God will be punished for their sin. Anyone who blasphemes the name of the Lord must be stoned to death by the whole community of Israel. Any native-born Israelite or foreigner among you who blasphemes the name of the Lord must be put to death. So this is a pretty harsh judgment or punishment for blasphemy. And so lots of things have happened over the history of Hebrew and Israelite culture, and also going into Christianity, of what constitutes blasphemy. There are persons within the Jewish heritage that would go so far as to write G-D, that way that they do not risk blaspheming the name of God. We, in my household, are pretty strict about, we don't say, oh my God. outside of the context of a prayer. So this leads to lots of reminding my daughter to say, oh my goodness, oh my gosh, my word, those types of phrases. Now, yes, they're a substitution for that, and one could argue that's rather pharisaical or rule bent. But God's power manifests in the name. At least in the Israelite and Christian tradition, we recognize that to invoke the name of God is to invoke the holy presence and power. And to do so without caution is to call down judgment or the opportunity for judgment upon ourselves. This is why later on in the Gospels, we lose some of the distinction. When Jesus says, I am, Jesus is literally saying the name of God and saying that he is. And that's why he often gets people trying to stone him or arrest him, is because he directly claims the name of God towards the end of his mission. So yeah, they stone him. And it seems very harsh. But I also wonder, would this person have needed stoned or killed if the Israelites were not so stubborn and stiff-necked people? Because remember, when God issues these harsh punishments and these harsh, you must not do this, and therefore it's better to kill all of those people than risk you doing it, is it because the people are bad? Yes. But is it also that the collective community is weak and stubborn and easily led astray? That too. So they stone him. And then God goes on to talk about what else needs to happen. Verse 17, anyone who takes another person's life must be put to death. So this verse, and also the commandments, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not kill, those linguistic distinctions have been fought and argued over for centuries. But the idea is to deliberately, with intent, take another's life. Or if you read elsewhere, as we've read in Leviticus, if you accidentally take someone's life, but you were negligent and your negligence caused that, there's punishment as if you did it on purpose because you were negligent. So again, this is boiling this down, and it's a reminder that lives are sacred and holy, and this isn't something we do lightly, that there is a high cost to pay for someone's life. Verse 18, and I think that's also, pause. That's also why God instructs them to do it in community. To stone a person is to say that this is not something that an individual does, but this is a communal, collective decision and judgment rendered. And we still sort of honor this way of thinking in our Judeo-Christian heritage of the law, where we require a jury of one's peers to rule that you are not only guilty, but then also for there to be capital punishment. So we have this sort of collective representation preserved within our justice system. Whether you believe in the death penalty or not is a whole other matter. We're going to go back to the Israelites right now and what their instructions are. Verse 18, anyone who kills another person's animal must pay for it in full, a live animal for the animal that was killed. Now, what we hear is that life is sacred. Life has value, and you have to accord it such. Verse 19, anyone who injures another person must be dealt with according to the injury inflicted. A fracture for an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Whatever anyone does to injure another person must be paid back in kind. So We have heard this saying, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and it's commonly used to justify seeking payback. But let's visit the historical context here and realize that this is actually a limit being placed on retribution. This is designed to limit blood feuds. This is designed to limit generations of seeking vengeance on one another. I mean, before you go, oh, well, that would not happen. It already has happened within the history of God's people. Remember, we have Jacob and Esau already fighting over birthright, and the concern within there when they're traveling through Esau's land is that he's going to come kill them. So this is a movement away from that type of system into a system that places limits on our own human sinful desires for rage and payback and retribution. Verse 21, whoever kills an animal must pay for it in full, but whoever kills another person must be put to death. Again, repetition tells us this is important. God makes a distinction between animal life and human life. And human life is super sacred. Animal life has value and meaning, but human life is sacred. And so, reminder, yeah, you can't just give someone a slave for the slave that you killed. You can't give your daughter for someone else's daughter. This is not what God had in mind. Verse 22, the same standard applies to both native-born Israelites and to the foreigners living among you. I am the Lord your God. So God is laying the foundation which says everybody is equal in the eyes of the law within your territory. If people choose to live here, even if they don't claim the title of Israelite, even if they don't convert and become a Jew, by choosing to live within your community, they have placed themselves under the strictures of your law. Now, this is something that is still playing out in history as we see tension between Muslim and Islam communities and Sharia law and other countries' laws. And so far, the ruling has been that if you choose to live within a sovereign nation, you're choosing to abide under their legal structure. Your laws cannot supersede or subvert theirs. We are seeing this, however, play out also within Judaism, as there are some lawsuits and things going on within the Orthodox Jewish community right now in the state of New York over the health crisis, there's the word, of COVID-19 and what is permissible and what is not during this crisis. So yeah, this is something that we still argue about. But God is setting a precedent here that choosing to live within this community binds you to these laws. So, moving forward, after Moses gave all these instructions to the Israelites, they took the blasphemer outside the camp and stoned him to death. The Israelites did just as the Lord had commanded Moses. All right, chapter 25, the Sabbath year. While Moses was on Mount Sinai, the Lord said to him, "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. When you have entered into the land I am giving you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath rest before the Lord every 7th year. For 6 years you may plant your fields and prune your vineyards and harvest your crops. But during the 7th year, the land must have a Sabbath year of complete rest. It is the Lord's Sabbath. Do not plant your fields or prune your vineyards during that year, and don't store away the crops that grow on their own, or gather the grapes from your unpruned wines. The land must have a year of complete rest. But you may eat whatever the land produces on its own during its Sabbath. This applies to you, your male and female servants, your hired workers, and the temporary residents who reside with you. Your livestock and the wild animals in your land will also be allowed to eat what the land produces. So God here is introducing the idea of Sabbath for not only the people, but the land itself. Now, modern horticulturalists and farmers will tell you that crop rotation and allowing land to lie dormant is essential to the continued productivity and benefit of the land and the people who depend on it. I don't think any of you are old enough to have lived through the Dust Bowl. I'm not going to ask if you were, but the Dust Bowl was a period in time where Americans had year after year after year planted the same crop and depleted the land so much so that everything got parched and dry, and the land basically died, and dust swept across the plain states. We came back from that, but we had to let the land be fallow. We had to invest in crop rotation that replenished the land, and we had to take into account the land itself has limitations. I think we're approaching another reckoning in this time frame now with global warming and consumerism, and the idea that the land itself has limits to what can be produced. And if we continue to push those limits, we may be in for a struggle. But God created another way. God created a design that 1 year in 7 was a year of rest. Now, what this requires, though, is extreme trust in the Lord. You have to trust that your 6th year crop is going to be enough to carry you forward. And you also have to trust that whatever the land just happens to produce on its own, meaning you haven't tended the fields, you didn't intentionally plant, but there might be some seeds that fell during the harvest, and you might get some from that. And you have to trust that that's going to be enough. That's really hard, to fully rely on God to say, I'm not going to plant this year. We'll wait and see what happens. There's not a lot of evidence that the Israelites faithfully did this. Some may have, but the next thing we're going to talk about, there is no evidence of it ever having been followed. So keep that in your framework mind when you hear about it. The year of Jubilee. In addition, you must count off 7 Sabbath years, 7 sets of 7 years, adding up to 49 years in all. Then on the Day of Atonement in the 50th year, blow the ram's horn loud, and this would have been Yom Kippur. So the Day of Atonement, the day when everyone is supposed to fast and have a Sabbath and pray for God, and their name is written in the book of life for another year. This is the 50th time. Blow the ram's horn loud and long throughout the land. Set this year apart as holy, a time to proclaim freedom throughout the land for all who live there. It will be a Jubilee year for you, when each of you may return to the land that belonged to your ancestors and return to your own clan. So if you sold yourself into slavery, which one did during these times if you became destitute, you would go free in the year of Jubilee. Also, if you ran into hard times, and let's say you had 100 acres and you sold off the back 40 because times were hard, Jubilee year, those acreage came back to you. And there was a reset. Now, there's no evidence that the Israelites ever had a year of Jubilee, unfortunately. But God intended it as a way of resetting the alignment of society and restoring people to their heritage, their rights, their values. And it would have been awesome if it worked. You can see why it probably didn't. Is it possible that we just have no record and maybe they did it once? Maybe. But again, all of our records indicate that they never did this. But let's read on about what it was meant to be. Verse 14, when you make an agreement with your neighbor to buy or sell property, you must not take advantage of each other. When you buy land from your neighbor, the price must be based on the number of years since the last Jubilee. The seller must set the price by taking into account the number of years remaining until the next year of Jubilee. So if I was going to buy your back 40 and it was 49 more years until the next Jubilee, I might pay you quite a bit. But if next year is the year of Jubilee and I'm buying your back 40, I'm not going to give you very much because I'm not going to have many seasons of use out of that land. The same way for servitude. If you were selling yourself into service and the number of years were small, we're not going to pay as many debts off or do as many things for you. But the miraculous thing about Jubilee was that all debts were written off and everything was supposed to go back to be reset. So the more years until the next Jubilee, the higher the price. The fewer years, the lower the price. After all, the person selling the land is actually selling you a certain number of harvests. Show your fear of God by not taking advantage of each other. I am the Lord your God. Again, God's desire for society, particularly this chosen society, is pretty incompatible with capitalist expansion. Because again, there's this function of reset. Now, I am not saying we need to redo the foundations of our economy or to change over drastically or radically to model this when we have no evidence that it ever worked. But we do have evidence of God's values, of what God wants for us, and for the least of these, is to have a chance of restoration. And so I hope we can, as Christians, in our policies and in the ways that we work in the world, work towards that. Verse 18, if you want to live securely in the land, follow my decrees and obey my regulations. Then the land will yield large crops, and you will eat your fill and live securely in it. But you might ask, what will we eat during the 7th year, since we are not allowed to plant or harvest crops that year? Be assured that I will send my blessing for you in the 6th year, so the land will produce a crop large enough for 3 years. When you plant your fields in the 8th year, you will still be eating from the large crop of the 6th year. In fact, you will still be eating from that large crop when the new crop is harvested in the 9th year. God says, you just got to trust me. It also requires, when we do have excess or more, to not live to the very edge of that margin, but to trust that God has given that excess for the times to come, and to set that aside and to use that faithfully rather than selling it off to make a profit. Trusting in God is essential to how faithful God is to the promises that were made to the people. All right, so now we're going to move from crops into the redemption of property. Verse 23, the land must never be sold on a permanent basis, for the land belongs to me. You are only foreigners and tenant farmers working for me. What would it take for us to wrap our mindset around the idea that literally everything we have belongs to God? And that we just get to use it. Few of us are property owners beyond maybe a small house or a couple acres. But this goes beyond the idea of land ownership and the idea that all of our property, all of our goods belong to God anyway. Working as a tenant farmer implies the need to do our work and our labor in a way that pleases the one we serve. I think we would be a lot healthier as people if we embodied that lens for ourselves. But verse 24, with every purchase of land, you must grant the seller the right to buy it back. If one of your fellow Israelites falls into poverty and is forced to sell some family land, then a close relative should buy it back for him. If there is no close relative to buy the land, but the person who sold it gets enough money to buy it back, he then has the right to redeem it from the one who bought it. The price of the land will be discounted according to the number of years until the next year of Jubilee. In this way, the original owner can then return to the land. So not only was everything have to reset every 50 years, but the ability to reset it between that time was reserved. You had to buy it back, but you could do so. Verse 28, but if the original owner cannot afford to buy back the land, it will remain with the new owner until the next year of Jubilee. In the Jubilee year, the land must be returned to the original owner so they can return to their family land. Anyone who sells a house inside a walled town has the right to buy it back for a full year after its sale. During that year, the seller retains the right to buy it back. So if you became homeless, you couldn't afford your house, but you were able to turn your fortunes around, you could buy it back. This is something, again, we don't have a lot of evidence that they did. And it's certainly something that we would not do in modern times. You can't force someone to sell back. We often, as children learn, well, no take backs. Again, this is saying the price is set based on the time till Jubilee, and they should be able to buy it back based on that leverage of purchase price. But with walls within the town, it's a little different. It doesn't just go back at the year of Jubilee. If it is not bought back within a year, the sale of the house within the walled town cannot reverse. It will become the permanent property of the buyer. It will not be returned to the original owner in the year of Jubilee. Why is this distinct? Well, again, when the Israelites go into the promised land, the land is divided out by clan and tribe. And so each clan and tribe has a portion of land that rightfully belongs to them. But the cities and the walled towns are sort of cooperative projects. Nobody really owns that land as a clan or a family. And so you can't claim family heritage within a walled town because it's not there. And so God says that you sold it, you're done. But if you're outside the walls, but a house in a village, a settlement without fortified walls, will be treated like property in the countryside. Such a house may be bought back at any time, and it must be returned to the original owner in the year of Jubilee. This is a peculiarity of ancient times and economy that you have to understand. When a town built a wall around it, it did so by the common agreement and the labor and the materials of the people living within that wall. So for the wall to go around your property, you had to agree to it, and you had to help support and provide for the function of that wall. Oftentimes, the actual back walls of people's houses would be worked in to the city walls themselves, which is why how you hear later in Jericho when they drop a rope down. No, not Jericho. We'll get there. I can't remember right now. But when they drop a rope down, a scarlet rope, to allow the people to know who had helped, that's why. Because they used the existing construction of people's homes to help fortify and build the wall. So yeah, you had to agree to it. And when you agreed to it, you agreed to sign over any long-term rights to the town co-op itself. And this happens still today. We don't have walls around our cities, but we have city limits. And neighborhoods and properties pay extra taxes or pay for sewer and drainage and those types of things to be considered within the city limits. So still today works somewhat similarly. But yes, they can't buy back the town house when it's part of a fortified city. Verse 32, the Levites always have the right to buy back a house they have sold within the towns allotted to them. Wait a minute, why are these people getting special treatment? Because the Levites have no land allotted to them. They have only their house in the town. Why? Because if you got land, you got to maintain it, you got to keep it, you got to raise crops, you got to do all the things to keep it functioning. And God's intent was that these Levites would be so busy working in and for the temple and the tabernacle and the synagogue and the worship that they wouldn't have time for that. So they don't have land. They're taken care of by other landowners. So they get to buy back their house whenever they need to. And any property, verse 33, that is sold by the Levites, all houses within the Levitical towns must be returned in the year of Jubilee. After all, the houses in the towns reserved for the Levites are the only property they own in all Israel. The open pasture land around the Levitical towns may never be sold. It is their permanent possession. So again, they have pasture land. They don't have crop land. Pasture land means that they can have sheep and they can have lambs, so they can have some dairy and they can have some other things for their family. That's a good thing. God wants priests to be taken care of, and he ensures for that. All right, now we're going to go into verse 35, redemption of the poor and enslaved. If one of your fellow Israelites falls into poverty and cannot support himself, support him as you would a foreigner or a temporary resident, and allow him to live with you. Do not charge interest or make a profit at his expense. Instead, show your fear of God by letting him live with you as your relative. Remember, do not charge interest on money you lend him or make a profit on the food you sell him. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan to be your God. All right, so we don't make, what is God saying? God is saying that all Israelites should treat each other as relatives and take care of one another in times of need. And you don't make a profit off of people. If you lend them money, fine, but don't charge them interest. If you sell them food, fine, but don't sell them at extortion prices. Kind of like gas stations. Have you ever been inside a convenience store that sells single rolls of toilet paper? We've got one near the church, actually. And this is a sign of extreme poverty in the area. People who can't pull together enough money to buy the big 24-pack at Walmart will buy things by the roll. But the price of that single roll is far more than the 24 packs total cost divided by 24. It's a way of taking advantage of people who are poor, charging them a higher price for the good because they can't afford to buy it in bulk or to have a car maybe to travel as far to get goods reliably. So yeah, God's saying don't do that. That's not good. Verse 39, if one of your fellow Israelites falls into poverty and is forced to sell himself to you, do not treat him as a slave. Treat him instead as a hired worker or a temporary resident who lives with you, and he will serve you only until the year of Jubilee. So don't treat people worse because of their circumstances, and treat them only as a hired hand, and they're going to go free in the year of Jubilee. At that time, he and his children will no longer be obligated to you, and they will return to their clans and go back to the land originally allotted to their ancestors. The people of Israel are my servants whom I bought out of the land of Egypt, so they must never be sold as slaves. Show your fear of God by not treating them harshly. So you could sell yourself into a life of servitude, or your family into a life of servitude if you were desperate and destitute. But you couldn't then be sold to somebody else. You did not become property to be transferred. It is to our great shame as a nation and as a Christian culture that we allowed slavery to exist as long as we did and justified it by so many means, when in the fabric and the framework of our faith are the instructions to not do this. But again, human beings are sinful and prone to falling away from God's utmost good and glory. Verse 44, however, you may purchase male and female slaves from among the nations around you. You may also purchase the children of temporary residents who live among you, including those who have been born in your land. You may treat them as your property, passing them on to your children as a permanent inheritance. You may treat them as slaves, but you must never treat your fellow Israelites this way. So here we have God allowing something that's sinful, that's wrong, that is a broken system to continue. Why would God let them do that? Again, my perspective, which is human and possibly broken, is that God knew the hard neck, the stiff neck, the stubbornness, and the problems within the people, and was moving them by degrees away from what the world believed to a greater good and glory. And I see this in the trajectory of when we come to Christ. And when Paul writes, in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. And in Philemon, or Philemon, however you want to pronounce that, when an escaped slave comes to Paul says, you should go back. But he also writes his master and says, you should free him. That's the arc we're moving towards. Mutual submission and submission to God. But we're far from there at this point in Leviticus. Verse 47, suppose a foreigner or temporary resident becomes rich while living among you. If any of your fellow Israelites fall into poverty and are forced to sell themselves to such a foreigner or to a member of his family, they still retain the right to be bought back, even after they have been purchased. They may be bought back by a brother, an uncle, or a cousin. In fact, anyone from the extended family may buy them back. They may also redeem themselves if they have prospered. They will negotiate the price of their freedom with the person who bought them. The price will be based on the number of years from the time they were sold until the next year of Jubilee, whatever it would cost to hire a worker for that period of time. If many years still remain until the Jubilee, they will repay the proper proportion of what they received when they sold themselves. If only a few years remain until the year of Jubilee, they will repay a small amount for their redemption. The foreigner must treat them as workers hired on a yearly basis. You must not allow a foreigner to treat any of your fellow Israelites harshly. If any Israelite had not been bought back by the time of the year of Jubilee arrives, they and their children must be set free at that time. For the people of Israel belong to me. They are my servants, whom I bought out from the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So God has created limits on human greed, human consumption, and on our own ability to use one another rightly or wrongly. God is creating those limits and these boundaries. Again, our evidence shows we weren't very good at following those boundaries. And eventually, the Israelites will be led into exile for their failure to obey. And eventually in Christ, we'll have the promises that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, but are bought back with the high price of Christ. So I'm going to end the recording here to allow you all to ask any questions you may have or make any comments.